In 1879, a homesteader in the Dakota Territory could build a one-room sod house to shelter his wife and 3 children for under $3.05. Today, that same family pays $1,800 a month to rent an apartment with a heating bill they cannot afford. Number 8 was so essential the US Army trained scouts in it during the Indian Wars. Number 1 has been almost completely forgotten, even though it was the difference between waking up alive and freezing to death. These 10 survival skills carried American settlers through blizzards, droughts, and winters when the nearest help was 40 miles of empty prairie away. Every single one disappeared because central heating, supermarkets, and the federal highway system spent a century making sure your great-grandparents' knowledge died with them. Before we begin, hit that subscribe button because what you are about to learn might change how you look at your own pantry tonight. Let us count down the 10 forgotten Wild West survival skills that kept settlers alive in the Badlands. Number 10. Reading the prairie sky for storms. On the open plains, a black cloud on the western horizon meant you had less than an hour. Across the Dakota Territory in the 1880s, settlers learned 3 signs: a yellow tint at sunset, cattle huddling against fence posts, and cottonwood leaves flipping silver side skyward. The US Weather Bureau, established in 1870, relied on prairie homesteader observations for decades. It was the closest thing a family had to insurance. Television forecasts buried the skill within 2 generations. Number 9. Burning buffalo chips for fuel. This sounds primitive until you see what it really was. On the treeless plains of Wyoming and the Dakotas in the 1870s, dried buffalo dung sold for 3 cents a bushel because there was nothing else to burn. Settlers walked behind herds with gunny sacks. The chips burned hotter than wood with almost no smoke. Records from the Department of the Interior tracked entire homestead communities, heated through winter on nothing else. It was the smell of survival on a windless January morning. Coal trains ended the practice within 20 years. Number 8. Building a sod house from the ground up. Almost nobody under 60 has ever set foot inside one. In Nebraska, Kansas, and the Dakota Territory between 1862 and 1890, a homesteader could build a complete one-room dwelling for $2.78 in nails and a borrowed plow blade. The settler cut squares of prairie sod 3 inches thick and 2 feet long, stacked them like bricks with the grass side down, and built walls 4 feet thick. The roof was timber if he could find it, and more sod if he could not. A small window of pig fat stretched over a wooden frame let in the only light. The interior stayed at 55 degrees in a 105-degree summer and held its warmth through 30 below winters. The Homestead Act of 1862 fueled the practice across more than 270 million acres of granted land. The US Army documented thousands of sod dugouts during cavalry surveys of the frontier. Inside those walls, families were born, taught to read, married, and buried. Lumber freight on the railroads ended the sod house by 1900. Number 7. Treating a rattlesnake bite in the saddle. This one is grim, but every cattle drive carried the knowledge. On the Chisholm Trail running from Texas to Kansas in the 1870s, a cowboy could expect at least 1 rattlesnake encounter for every 200 miles ridden, and there were no doctors. The frontier method involved a sharp knife, a leather strap above the bite, and a poultice of plantain leaves and chewed tobacco pressed into the wound. The rider kept the limb still and stayed conscious by force. The American Medical Association documented the field method in case studies through 1920. It was knowledge passed from father to son around a campfire. Modern anti-venom made the skill obsolete in 3 decades. Number 6. Finding clean water in alkali country. Most settlers who died of thirst on the frontier were within a mile of water and could not see it. Across the Great Basin and the High Plains in the 1860s, Alkali poisoning killed more pioneers than Indian conflict. Settlers watched for green willow growth in a dry wash and dug at the lowest point of any cottonwood grove. They tested the water by dropping in a silver coin. If the coin tarnished black, the water was poisoned. Records from the Mormon Battalion and the Oregon Trail wagon companies tracked these methods. It was the difference between reaching California and dying in the Nevada salt flats. Cattle troughs and well pumps quietly buried the knowledge by 1910. Number 5. Making pemmican that lasted 2 years. This was the original survival ration of the American West. Plains tribes had perfected pemmican over centuries, and white trappers adopted it across the Rocky Mountain fur trade between 1820 and 1870. A pound cost roughly 8 cents to make and provided 3,000 calories of dense fuel. Lean buffalo or beef was sliced thin, dried hard in the sun, pounded to powder between 2 flat stones, and mixed with rendered tallow and dried choke cherries. The mixture was sealed with hot fat in a stitched buffalo gut. The Hudson Bay Company recorded shipments lasting 2 years without spoilage. It was the food that crossed the Rockies in saddlebags. The Pacific Railroad and canned goods ended the trade by 1890. Number 4. Air curing meat with nothing but salt and wind. The Wild West had no refrigeration, but it had something better. Across Texas, Wyoming, and the New Mexico Territory in the 1850s, a single steer carcass could be reduced to 80 pounds of finished jerky for the price of 1 sack of rock salt, about 47 cents. Cowboys and ranch wives cut the meat into long, thin strips, rolled them in salt and pepper, and hung them from cotton lines stretched between 2 poles. The dry desert wind did the rest in 3 days. The U.S. Cavalry Quartermaster ration logs from the Indian Wars listed jerky as a staple field ration through 1890. It was the taste of long cattle drives and lonely outposts. Refrigerator cars ended the practice by World War I. Number 3. Rendering tallow for light, soap, and waterproofing. A single buffalo or steer could light a homestead for 9 months. On the high plains in the 1870s, store-bought candles cost 11 cents per pound, so settlers made their own from rendered fat. The fat was simmered in a heavy iron kettle for hours, strained through cheesecloth, and poured into hand-dipped molds with cotton wicks. The same tallow doubled as soap base, leather grease, and waterproof seal for sod house roofs. The U.S. Department of Agriculture recorded farm tallow production into the 1920s. It was the soft yellow light of every kitchen window after sundown. Kerosene lamps and rural electrification erased the skill in a single generation. Number 2. Keeping a sourdough starter alive on the trail. This one is small, but it traveled across the entire continent. Between 1849 and the 1890s, every wagon train, every mining camp, and every cattle drive west of the Missouri carried a small jar of fermented flour and water that cost the bearer almost nothing in coin and everything in attention. A sourdough starter is wild yeast and bacteria living together in a paste. It must be fed with fresh flour and water every 2 to 3 days, kept warm against the bearer's body in winter, and protected from frost. From that single jar came biscuits at every meal, sourdough pancakes for ranch hands at 4 in the morning, and the rough, crusty bread that fed prospectors at 8,000 feet. The most prized starters were brought from German and Polish immigrant kitchens in the 1870s. The Department of Agriculture documented sourdough as the dominant frontier, leavening through 1920. It was the closest thing a homesteader had to an heirloom. Commercial yeast packets sold by the railroad in the 1920s ended a tradition that had crossed the Rocky Mountains in saddlebags. Number 1. Banking the fire to last through the night. This was the skill that separated the families who survived their first winter from the families who did not. On the Dakota Plains, in the Wyoming High Country, in the dugouts of the Nebraska Sand Hills, a settler in 1875 had no reliable matches, and no kindling that would catch wet wood at 4 in the morning. The fire that warmed supper had to become the fire that cooked breakfast, and the temperature outside the sod walls would not climb above 0 for another 6 hours. The technique was simple in description and brutally exacting in practice. The settler raked the day's coals into a tight bed at the back of the hearth, covered them with a thick layer of soft ash, and packed it down with an iron shovel. The coals breathed slowly through the night, glowing red but never consuming. By dawn, a settler could rake the ash aside, blow on the embers, and have a cooking fire in 5 minutes. The skill is documented in Mormon pioneer journals, U.S. cavalry winter encampment records, and homestead diaries held by the Library of Congress. It was the heart of every house, kept alive by women who barely slept. It was the difference between waking up to breakfast and waking up to a frozen child. Central heating and the kitchen match ended a 400-year-old American practice between 1920 and 1955. Every culture that ever survived a hard winter has a version of the banked fire. Every grandmother has known what to do at 4 in the morning when the wind pushes snow under the door. When you watch the last coal of a campfire fade tonight, you are watching something your great-great-grandparents tended every night of their lives. Here is my challenge: try one of these skills this week, just one. Build a small fire and bank it for an hour. Make a batch of jerky on a window screen. Read the sky tomorrow. I tried banking a fire on a cold March night last year, expecting nothing. The next morning, the embers were still warm enough to start breakfast, and I finally understood something my grandfather had tried to tell me when I was 8. Share which skill you're going to try in the comments. I want to know if the sourdough pulls more interest than the sod house. These were not survival hacks. They were the operating manual of a generation that knew the land could kill you and refused to let it. The settlers who lived through the Badlands understood that comfort is borrowed, and competence is the only inheritance that matters. That is the inheritance worth keeping.